Hi, everyone. This is Tim Guy here to talk about the action research project I've done over the last couple of weeks, the flipped classrooms effectiveness and student attitudes. Just a little bit of background on me, just in case you didn't remember. Again, my name is Tim Guy. I'm part of the STEM Masters program at Millersville here, and I am a middle school math teacher at Spring Grove School District out in York County, in case you're not familiar. So the purpose of my actual research was to see how effective the flipped classroom can actually be. Basically, I wanted to go out and see how it affects student learning outcomes and whether it really is a viable alternative to a more traditional setup, whether it's better than a traditional setup or worse, just to see basically how effective it can really be. The reason why I really wanted to look into this is that at our school, a lot of different teachers are trying flipped classroom strategies. We're a one-to-one school. All of our kids have iPads, so it's become sort of like the hot thing to do to look into these different strategies. And honestly, I'm always looking for new ways to improve student achievement. It can be really difficult sometimes with certain students to figure out how to really reach them and connect them and get them to improve in their math abilities. And this seems like a logical way to try to reach some of those kids and get them more independently thinking about mathematics. So my research question when I went out to do this was how will student achievement on formative assessments change when students are engaging in a flipped classroom? Just a little bit of background looking at my research that I did before I went into this. I basically looked at 5 main studies that kind of guide what I was looking at. The first one is from a Malek Jatawi. I don't think I said that correctly, but in 2019, and his study was all about looking at how the flipped classroom really affects student self-regulation and self-independence. Basically, the big theory out there is that the flipped classroom makes you a self-sufficient learner, and that by doing it, you get more of those study skills and things that really we look for in all of our students to be more independent. So he went out to look to see if it actually did that, and according to his research, it was actually improving the student's ability to have the independence and to do those self-sufficient learning routines, like independent studying and things such as that. Another research study I looked up was by Alsenkak and Ozdemir. This was done in 2018, and basically they were looking at just does the flipped classroom work? Does it actually improve learning outcomes? Do students improve? Do they improve when you do a learning flipped classroom? And what they found was that yes, students did improve. They did actually get better on the flipped classroom. However, they kind of went against the previous study, and they found that the students did not show any more of those self-directed abilities, those self-sufficient learning abilities that Malek said that they did have there. The next study by Cabby was in 2018. He, again, just looked to see how effective the flipped classroom can be. Now, his study is a little bit different than the previous one because he was comparing it to a traditional classroom to see if they improve, is one better than the other. And what he found was that there wasn't much difference in student improvement between the flipped and the traditional classroom. Students performed about the same, and therefore he didn't see much of a difference between either one in terms of how students are doing. Yildirim in 2017 went out to see how it compared to a traditional classroom as well. And in his instance, instead of looking at just student achievement, he was more looking at what students thought about the flipped classrooms compared to a traditional classroom. Do they like learning in this environment? Because, having your students enjoy what they're doing can be really important. And what he found is that students really did have a high opinion of the flipped classroom. The students that engaged in it said that they liked some of the independence, they liked some of the way the activities were structured, and they actually really preferred it over what they were traditionally how they were being taught before. The last study is from Lowe and Hugh in 2017. They looked to see how they can improve what student opinions are on the flipped classroom. What are the things that make students like a flipped classroom, and what are some things that you can do to make sure your flipped classroom is successful? And what they kind of fell back on was that flipped classrooms that followed what they called the first principles of instruction were the ones that students tend to like versus other styles of flipped classroom. Those first principles of instruction, what those really are talking about are setting up your flipped classroom so that students are engaging in real world problems, putting in forth for them like real problems that they then have to figure out and solve, and using the in-class portion of the flipped classroom time to do those sorts of things. So those were the 5 studies that I kind of looked at before I went in and did my own research. Just to kind of talk about the design of my research and how I went about this. I teach 2 different pre-algebra classes, so I decided to assign each one a learning style. So one class was given the flipped classroom, and the other class was just taught in a more traditional manner that I've been teaching before, using direct instruction during class time, doing independent work and things like that, all during the class time. The way I implemented my flipped classroom was by using an app called Nearpod. This is an app where you can put videos and questions kind of all embedded together and almost make like a slideshow that the students can go through and work through. And I use that to sort of set up and organize my flipped classroom. And that way I could see immediately what kids were doing it, what kids were not doing it, and some of the questions and stuff, and get feedback immediately from them through that app. In order to gauge how students were improving in terms of their learning outcomes, I gave a pretest and a post-test. These tests were exactly the same pretest and post-test, so it showed straight up what their improvement was because it was the exact same test given twice. I also looked at the warm-ups, conclusions, and Nearpod questions that students were answering as they went through to provide some more background, almost anecdotal evidence to support the things that the pretest and the post-test were saying. I then went ahead and I collected data on the student improvement and how much the students were participating during the flipped classroom. This was all quantitative data that I was collecting, so more quantitative over qualitative. My findings when I went through, so the first thing I wanted to look at was the student participation, because this is actually going to affect some of the stuff we're going to see later in terms of my results. But as you can see from this chart and just by what's written here, the students who were in the flipped classroom, their participation in what was going on started to dip as time went on here. In the beginning, for the first 3 lessons, every student was doing everything that was assigned to them on Nearpod. By the end, only 77% were fully participating. And what I mean by that is that when they had class the next day, that's how many were completed. So then the 23% of students by the end who did not complete it, they then had to do that in class before they could join us for the in-class portion of their flipped classroom. And that obviously is a pretty big percentage. It's almost a quarter of my students by the end who were not doing the lessons ahead of time. And that definitely could have an impact on the rest of the research because as I found, yes, the flipped classroom did improve learning outcomes. The students did improve, but they improved about the same, if maybe a little worse than a traditional classroom. The 4% here, the 55% for flipped classroom improvement versus 59% for traditional, in the grand scheme of things, with how small the groups were that I had, is pretty much negligible. And in fact, I ran a t-test just to see how negligible that difference was. And basically, we are not confident at all that these are different. These are pretty much about the same. They were performing about the same, the flipped classroom and the traditional. Okay, so they're not significantly different at all, which basically means that the flipped classroom, when we look at achievement, does about the same as your traditional teaching. Now, that's not an awful thing to find because what it shows is that the flipped classroom is a viable teaching method. It's not something that's going to necessarily hurt your students to be involved in flipped classroom. In fact, it's about the same as a traditional classroom according to this research. Now, there are a lot of things that kind of fall into that. Obviously, the sample size is not large enough to get a really great amount of data here. Also, the student participation, how many students were participating, definitely could have affected that flipped classroom data. So I actually am thinking about keep trying flipped classroom in my with my students because I can obviously see that it doesn't hurt them. And in fact, this was my first time trying it, whereas I've done traditional lessons for a really long time. And to have these results is pretty encouraging that it could eventually do better for them as they get more experience with doing it. And I definitely think the key to unlocking that is to figuring out how to get the student participation up. How do I make sure all the students do the lesson the night before that I want? And this is something that's really important for a school because, again, we're a one-to-one school. A lot of teachers are implementing flipped classrooms or trying flipped classroom, looking at things. And so in the future, I really want to work with them and kind of see what are some things that they find works to get their students engaged with it every night and working on it. What are some things they find have worked and not worked, and really kind of hone in on what kind of makes this flipped classroom as great as possible, and what are things that really make it work well. Kind of going back to one of those research studies that I talked about in terms of what are the things that make students like doing it, what are the things that make it successful. So that's kind of the future that I'm looking for based off this action research and where I want to go. Thank you very much for watching.